I call Derek Ball.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak on the Social Security Commencement of Benefits Amendment Bill. In its essence, sir, it's a rather simple bill insofar as it's wanting to change one part or one clause, and I'd just like to read out part of the general policy statement. This bill amends the Social Security Act 1964 to correct with retrospective effect to 3rd of June 1998 an error in the legislation that does not give effect to the policy intent that a benefit commences on the day after a stand-down period ends, as opposed to the day on which the stand-down period ends. So, in other words, sir, it's as the Minister has said, and other members as well, this is a technical error in law and not a change in policy. And that is the basis with which, and the reason why New Zealand First will be supporting this bill. There are a couple of issues, however, sir, and firstly I want to talk about the process which we're going through at the moment under urgency. And one of the major, there's a couple of issues through that process, and one of them is the lack of communication from the Minister and from the government as a whole in regards to change in legislation, what it's going to look like, the intent, and even when we were going to go through the legislation and go through urgency itself. And with legislation like this, which is actually correction in law that spans successive governments, you would think that communication was key. And the second reason, sir, is why. And the second reason why, sir, is in fact why we're going through urgency in the first place. And putting the timeline together, like Jan Logie did. In fact, it was this change in legislation was actually placed in another piece of legislation, and it was found. And months later, in fact 18 months later, we are now finding ourselves under urgency. And what's the reasons for that? And I think that it boils down to the fact that the government was found out and wants to rush it through to ensure that they're not fiscally disadvantaged in the end, sir. But there is one key point that has been brought up by Labour, and that is actually that the government knew of this issue back in May 2014. And in the departmental disclosure statement, in fact it was the last paragraph we've got there, under any other unusual provisions or features, just part of it says that the Ministry of Social Development's operational practice should have been amended when the error was discovered on 20th of May 2014. So the question that obviously comes out of that is, why wasn't the operational practice amended in May? And as we can see, and as I stated right at the start, sir, it is actually a simple enough bill. It's a simple enough change. Why wasn't it changed? Why wasn't the issue communicated to the beneficiaries and to the public back in May? And on the communication part, sir, with the beneficiaries, I mean, it's all good and well to give them 6 or 7 weeks. I think it's been pushed out now to the 8th of January. Again, the lack of communication from the Minister is disappointing. However, though that time period is only because of a result of the process that we're in now under urgency. If we weren't under urgency to get this pushed through, there would be no need for a time limit on when people can apply who got a benefit from May 2014. And the other question actually is, sir, is if out of a matter of principle and fairness that there is a 6 or 7 or 8 week period where beneficiaries that receive the benefit from May onwards can apply, why isn't everyone being able to get the benefit, the back pay for that? Why do they have to make an application to do so? If in this day and age with digital and computers and records and everything else like that, back to May 2014, there will obviously be records of all of those beneficiaries that will be eligible for this back pay. So why are we going through a rigmarole of making beneficiaries apply when it can be automatically done? That's a question, hopefully, that the Minister can answer during the committee stages. Also part of in fact, sir, the two main reasons why New Zealand First is supporting this bill is the intent of the original legislation and the intent of the stand-down period itself. And it's easy actually to get caught up in the being dragged down an emotive pathway where we are seeing the effects of beneficiaries' poverty. We've got a bill coming through, the Children in Hardship Bill, also coming through the House, sir, that we've had stories about children who are homeless in Auckland, that we've got issues with child poverty throughout New Zealand. Obviously, those are big problems for this country, but this is not the problem. This is not the legislation that we need to change that will fix that problem. And Labour and the Greens are opposing this bill based on that emotive pathway. I'd actually like to look at in reference to that, look at the departmental disclosure statement again, sir, and it highlights right at the start that it's an error in the legislation and it does not give effect to the policy intent. So New Zealand First stance is that if you take those beneficiaries from day one, from 1998, if the legislation itself was written to the intent of the bill, so we know that it wasn't, so if the legislation was written to the intent of the bill, those beneficiaries would have received exactly the same amount as they already have. So if the legislative error wasn't there, the beneficiaries would be no better off today than when the mistake was made. So we're correcting that, and we've heard from Labour and from the Greens that the beneficiaries are owed money, that they missed out on a day, but the intent of the original legislation states that they didn't. And of course, sir, if the situation was reversed and the intent was for them to have the extra day and they didn't, of course, we'll be holding the government to account on that.
Yeah, good point.
Also, sir, there's an issue with the retrospective effect, and it states that in this case, the retrospective provisions can be justified to ensure that the government policy intent is upheld, that the practice and understanding that has been previously applied by the MSD is validated, and that financial costs to the Crown that were not anticipated are avoided. And New Zealand First does agree with that, sir. And I'd just like to finish off, sir, actually, with a 3 News article that is about this urgent government bill that's going through to fix a benefit error. And in fact, TV3 states that beneficiaries are being underpaid by 1 day. And that is actually disingenuous to report that, because that is not actually the case. Beneficiaries have not been underpaid by 1 day. The intent of the bill was fulfilled, and that is why New Zealand First is supporting this bill, sir. And it also says that, in fact, the Minister has said it too, that it has always been government policy that the benefit will commence the day after a stand down, and that the stand down period is a 7-day period. So it's not just the national government, it's been successive governments, and it's a little bit contradictory for the Labour Party to actually oppose this when the policy intent was being fulfilled under the Labour government too. So, sir, I've got a few more things that I'd like to say, which I will say in the second reading and in the committee of the whole House. But at this stage, sir, we will be supporting the bill. Thank you.